Hi, and welcome to another episode of Babes in Bookland. I'm your host, Alex Franca, and today I am going to be talking about Crazy Brave by Joy Harjo with my friend Priscilla. So glad you're here. Hi, Priscilla.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. First, P, I wanted to know your thoughts on the book.
Actually, this is the first book that I've read from a Native American's perspective, or her words are Indian perspective. So I thought it was heartbreaking. I thought it was very, very powerful and heartbreaking. But I think that by the end of it, there's a lot to appreciate in terms of redemption, resilience, and she just sounds like a badass woman.
You know, on the back of the book, there's all of these blurbs, and the Boston Globe wrote this: a saga about the survival of spirituality and creativity in the face of generations of racism, dispossession, and familial dysfunction. Fantastic, terrible, and beautiful. I thought that really was it in a nutshell. I think that her memoir is about transcendence and transformation. It touches on the beginning of her life up until the point where she becomes a poet, really gives into poetry. So it's really just the first chunk of her life. It's not written traditionally or even chronologically. She weaves in her poetry, memories, and experiences of other lives and visions as she takes us through her journey where she endured abuse, poverty, to find salvation in art and strength in herself. I found it incredibly moving. And although I did struggle with her writing style some of the time, I think once I got used to it, I was really able to lose myself in her words. And like you, I really appreciated her courage in telling her journey. So, a little bit of background about Crazy Brave. It was released in 2012. And here's her dedication: to the warriors of the heart, to my teachers in the East, North, West, and South, above and below. And this book was written by the 2019 Poet Laureate of the United States. She was not the Poet Laureate when she wrote this memoir. She later became the Poet Laureate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's get into it. So, first, I like to start off with quick topics, and I like to start my quick topics with new words that I discovered while reading this memoir. There were quite a few. One of them was doggerel. Had you ever heard of that word?
No,
Were there a couple words where you had to stop and be like, what does that mean?
I definitely did, but usually I'll look it up. On this one, I felt like I told you, I felt like I had to keep going back and forth just to keep myself with the story, that
Mhm.
I didn't look these words up. I just kind of use context clues, which
Nice.
is why I say words improperly in sentences.
You know what? At least you're trying. So, doggerel is poetry that is irregular in rhythm and in rhyme, often deliberately. Another word that I discovered is hogan, a traditional Navajo hut of logs and earth. Confluence, which is an act or process of merging, and subsume, include or absorbed into something else. It's always fun to learn new words. And then I try to incorporate them into my vocabulary. And oftentimes I fail because there's not many times where you need to bring up confluence or subsume in normal conversation, especially when you're talking to a 5-year-old most of the time. But one can try. Joy is the Poet Laureate of the United States. And I wanted to do a little mini deep dive into that because I've heard that term, but I never really understood what a poet laureate, what that meant. The poet laureate's position is funded by a private gift from Archer M. Huntington, and they make about $60,000 a year. The poet laureate is appointed annually by the Librarian of Congress. In making the appointment, the library's Literary Initiative Office consults with the current laureate, former appointees, distinguished poetry critics, scholars, booksellers, leaders of literary organizations, and others who are deeply knowledgeable about poetry. The poet laureate is typically appointed between June and August, and his or her official term typically lasts from September to April. The poet laureate may be appointed to a second term by the Librarian of Congress. 2 consecutive terms is considered the maximum length of a poet laureate's tenure. Only 2 poet laureates have been appointed to a third term. Robert Pinsky served a third term by special request of the librarian during the library's bicentennial, and Joy Harjo. Because of her project, they wanted to allot her more time. So she was named Poet Laureate of the US in 2019, 7 years after this memoir's release. And her project is called Living Nations, Living Worlds. And it sounds so cool. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. This is what she says about it. I conceived the idea of mapping the US with Native nations poets and poems. I want this map to counter damaging false assumptions that Indigenous peoples of our country are often invisible or are not seen as human. You will not find us fairly represented, if at all, in the cultural storytelling of America, and nearly non existent in the American Book of Poetry. Like other living American poets, Native nations poets use the tools of knowledge and creativity to ride the waves of language, even as we also tend to our Indigenous cultural systems and communities. Our common language of English, or sometimes Spanish, is a crossing place, a place to meet many from all over the world. And like any other group of humans, we travel for economic opportunities, for education, for love, and for adventure. Though we may venture far from our origin story, we are bound by genealogy, by land, even by instinct. So that's what she did. She did a map of the United States using poems and poetry by Indigenous Native people. And you can find it all online and it is very cool. So I wanted to share. And like I said, you can find it. You just Google Living Nations, Living Worlds, and it's like this interactive map that you click.
Okay, hold on. I actually want to look at that. That's amazing.
So it says each location marker reveals a Native Nations poet and features an image, biography, and a link to hear the poet recite and comment on an original poem.
I see. It's like an interactive map. That is so
So it says each of the 47 Native Nations poets featured in Living Nations, Living Worlds selected an original poem on the theme of place and displacement, and with 4 touch points in mind: visibility, persistence, resistance, and acknowledgement. Each also chose where they wish to place themselves on the map.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. So, I mean, I'm doing it on my mobile and you're on your laptop. So, the website is through the Library of Congress, and you just scroll down and you meet all of these Native Nations poets, and you can click and learn more about them and hear the poem that they decided to offer up as a part of this project that Joy spearheaded.
Got you. Aw. I feel like maybe it's different because of the documentary I worked on, but like I feel like lately Native Americans have been slowly but surely being brought closer towards the forefront, like their stories.
Well, tell me more about the documentary that you worked on, that you because you worked with some Native American comics. Is that what you're talking about? That
Yeah,
one?
yeah. We were at the Navajo Nation. I actually learned the term Hogan there because I called it a hut. And they're like, that's not a hut, that's a Hogan. I'm like, oh, okay.
Nice.
I don't know if every nation looks like that or every Native American reservation looks like that, but it is very much a underdeveloped community
Mm-hmm.
who has just as rich of a story, if not richer, because of their history. And it's bizarre to realize it's an entire demographic story not being told.
Especially when they lived here first and we came and stole their lands as colonizers. It's really hard to like grapple with what our country did to a group of people and how they've continued to be systemically oppressed. We'll definitely touch on that more as we get deeper into her memoir because she writes about the results of that systemic oppression. I think it's really important that these stories are coming forward. And I think it's important that we don't try to skirt our, as a country. I mean, because your family were recent, you're here, your first generation born here. My family came in like the early 1900s, but still collectively as a country, our responsibility and our part in that. And I think we have to talk about the ugly, dirty parts of our history in order to move forward and not repeat the same mistakes. And I think that that stuff is really warranted and necessary. You can't just pretend that this never happened or that these people haven't suffered because of it for decades later.
Right, right. I mean, it's woven into who we are as human beings. So to negate that is to negate where we're at today. Because like I don't know if that's the experience all around, but I went to the Navajo Nation and they were just lovely. And we were there for 4th of July and we were just like, do you guys celebrate 4th of July or what do you guys do? And it was pretty split. Like half of the people were like, we don't celebrate this, and there's a lot of politics involved in terms of what's happening now. But then the other half is like, we are veterans ourselves. We went to war for this country and we are respecting and honoring the veterans today, not necessarily like the land. It's sad that these stories aren't being told because I feel like there's this layer of division when the reality is like they are just as they fought in the war. They have every reason to hate Americans, and here they are fighting along their side and trying to protect the land just as hard. It is actually very conflicting and confusing, but we can get into that because obviously she digs into that a lot.
That's such a great segue to our deeper discussion points of the memoir. Joy writes so much about ancestry and those from which she came and her parents and the way that they could and couldn't navigate life and the way that she continues to try to navigate through her life. So I want to give a little bit of background about Joy and then we'll dive in deeper. So Joy was born in 1951 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And she writes, Tulsa was a Creek Indian town established on the Arkansas River after my father's people were forcibly removed from their homes in the South in the mid 1800s. When they arrived in this new land, they brought sacred fire. They brought what they could carry. Some African people came with them as family members, others as slaves. Other African people arrived independently, established their towns. European and American settlers took over the lands that were established for settlement of Eastern tribes in what became known as Indian Territory. The Christian God gave them authority. Yet everyone wanted the same thing: peace, a place to make a home, cook, fall in love, make children, and music. I had no idea that Indigenous people had African people as slaves.
I didn't either.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought that was really interesting. So she writes that her father's family became wealthy when they discovered oil on their land, and that her mother's ancestry is Irish and Cherokee. So we kind of spoke on this earlier, but Joy writes about how, as she's writing the memoir, the spirits of her ancestors come forth and they are kind of telling her that they want their stories to be told. She writes, they speak softly with kindness. They are quick with humor and keep an open path. They have been tested with suffering and have responded with wisdom rather than bitterness. They teach by story, images, and songs, and they are respectful to mystery. They continue to remind me that it is best to walk this earthly path with VNEKTCKV, but it means compassion. She continues, all I have to do is remember them, and they stand in memory in kind light. My only frame of reference of like ancestors guiding people is in Mulan.
I was gonna say I can already see. I already know where you're going with it.
I'm talking about the cartoon version, not the remake. I have no idea how they addressed it in the remake. But yeah, that and then a little bit in Turning Red, the Disney movie that came out a couple years ago. I would love to have ancestors to guide me. Certain ones. I think I would just love to feel connected to my history, my family history in that way. I didn't get to know my great grandparents at all. Well, I got to know my great grandmother. She passed away when I believe I was 8 or 9. But most of my experience with her was when she unfortunately had dementia and didn't really know me or wasn't able to tell stories of family. I think that's one thing that I appreciate about the Indigenous people's culture is this connectedness that they have with their past and that their past is important and feels like family stories get passed down and are really important in a way that in my family I haven't experienced. What about you?
I would say probably in the last 5 years was the first time that I explored more of my history. My dad was in the Vietnam War, and growing up, it was just my sister and I don't know if it's because we were girls, but he didn't really talk about his experience with the war much to us. We would ask questions and he would answer, but it's one of those things where it's like, I don't really know the right questions to ask. In the last 5 years, we started doing these really big cousins reunions. Our family is massive. We probably have like 40 plus cousins. So I have cousins that were born in Vietnam. And so it wasn't until these family reunions that we started hearing more stories from our cousins' account of coming from Vietnam to America. And that was what was able to help us prompt more questions to my dad, more questions to our parents. And next year, actually, we are doing a reunion with our family, and it's our 50-year anniversary from like being in America. Isn't that wild? 50 years.
Wow. Wow.
I'm Asian American. I'm not American. I look around and I don't look like anybody here. So it's important to not only explore, but understand my culture because that is ultimately my living experience. My living experience isn't being here. So I think for Joy talking about it, and how like these stories are passed down. And when I was reading that part in the book, it really did feel like when I shot the documentary at the Navajo Nation, that's all they do. They sit around, they tell their stories, they tell all the things that they've gone through. And I think it's because each generation is hopeful that they're setting up the next generation for something better. And how are you going to acknowledge that it's better? Or how do you know where to go if you don't understand where the previous generation came from, what they did to get to where they are now? Like, it's all a learning process. And I'm sure Joy has her own relatability to this, but I think that it's a mixture of our parents having a hard time telling these stories. Like, it sounds like Indigenous people have such a graceful way, like the way she said, like without bitterness and with compassion. That's really hard when you're talking about genocide. Like, our people were completely killed and displaced, and somehow how do we pass on this story with grace, forgiveness, and love? Like, that's a lot. That's a tall order there. I don't know if our family has done that as gracefully. I think that they talk a lot about their struggles, and it's more of the sacrifice that they have made for us to have a better life. I think for her, it's like these are the stories of where you're from and identity. It helps you learn about your identity and direction, and you have this community that can help guide you and will always be there for you. I think for me in the Asian culture, it's much more of we sacrificed a lot. We literally left our home country so that you can have a better life. It's hopeful, but it almost is just like a lot of pressure to make something of what you were given when they have literally given up everything for it, you know?
Yeah, I think it's the difference too between having somebody come into your land and your space and take it away from you, whereas your parents were actively fleeing to America in because it is promised to be this American dream scenario. But I know that you have also shared with me that your father he was expressing the importance of you keeping up with your Vietnamese and practicing your Vietnamese and preserving the culture and the language because of what's currently happening in Vietnam right now. And so I think sometimes when we tell these stories, it's also in preservation of who we are at the heart of ourselves and what our culture was and how that needs to continue to be carried on even though there are all these other things that are trying to be a part of it, or like what's happening in Vietnam, where something's overtaking it. Similar in America to what happened to Indigenous people.
Definitely, yeah. Preservation is like a huge thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I think everyone to some degree when they pass hopes that they leave something meaningful or valuable behind.
Yeah.
And it's your story, if not more than that. Yeah, what you were saying about my dad is more of like if all the stories end and nothing is remembered quote unquote accurately, all you have left is your language. And, the Vietnamese language has changed substantially. Like the way that my dad speaks is different than how the local Vietnamese community now speaks. So I think that that's why he instills us to remember our language so much and make sure we teach our children and all of that. Because I think ultimately you're right. When he's gone, he hopes that his name lives on. He hopes that all their sacrifice is remembered. And I mean, I would feel the same way, it's a scary thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Self preservation and group preservation, right? Or cultural preservation. Joy also writes a lot about acknowledging our place within the family story. She writes, a story matrix connects all of us. There are rules, processes, and circles of responsibility in this world. And the story begins exactly where it is supposed to begin. We cannot skip any part. We're all born in the time that we're born and to the people that we are born to. And you kind of only have the choice to make the best of it.
Yeah, I don't know why I took that as like it's like embracing the good and the bad historically and presently. It's like the cliche thing where I have no regrets because all the things that I did suffer,
Led me here.
yeah, led you here. Like if you're happy with where you're at now, then you almost have to embrace all the good and the bad.
When you're going through a tough time, it's hard to remember that you will be happy again one day. She writes, though I was reluctant to be born, I was attracted by the music. I had plans. I was entrusted with carrying voices, songs, and stories to grow and release into the world, to be of assistance and inspiration. These were my responsibility. I am not special. It is this way for everyone. We enter into a family story and then other stories based on tribal clans, on tribal towns, and nations, lands, countries, planetary systems, and universes. Yet we each have our own individual soul story to tend.
It's like so big, but it almost makes me feel so small, realizing how like interconnected we all are, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
I find that when I think of my soul less than me, there it almost relinquishes for some reason this pressure of time, and I almost feel timeless, and it's like my, because I guess I have the belief that my soul will carry on, so it almost is like, okay, you know what, it's, you're not limited, I'm not, it's going to be okay, you can stay present because you're not as restricted with time. For some reason when I hear the word soul, that's what's freeing to me, is the removal of this pressure of time.
I think that's fantastic. And that completely makes sense to me and resonates with me as well. She has something in her life, and she calls this the knowing. She writes, "The knowing was my rudder, a shimmer of intelligent light, unerring in the midst of this destructive, terrible, and beautiful life. It is a strand of the divine, a pathway for the ancestors and teachers who love us." She also writes, "The knowing always spoke softly, wisely." Her parents get divorced. Her mother remarries. Her stepmother turns out to not be a very good guy at all. And we will get into that a little bit more. But at one point, she's desperate to flee his home and she thinks about going to California. A man she meets at a party says that he can help her prostitute herself in California, like make a living. She's desperate to leave, but the knowing shows her that if she runs away, her life will be cut short. Years later, she has her palm read by a psychic, and she tells her that in another lifeline, she died of a drug overdose on the streets of California at 16 or
Crazy.
17.
It's giving me chills right now, actually.
Me too. Oh, it's so crazy to think about the roads not traveled in our lives. Joy deals with a lot of abuse in her life. She has a father who deals with alcoholism and he is abusive to her mother.
Joy talks a lot about abuse with her father, but you can definitely tell in her writing that there's conflict in how she even digests that information herself, or how she's processed that information. And I think that goes into the theme of family, the theme of culture and your ancestors. So there's a lot of respect and love innately for someone who is your father. You want to respect this person, you want to love them, and they are part of who you are.
And I think you want them to feel worthy of your love.
100%. But then there's this conflict of, this person does really hurtful things to me, to my mom. So I actually really like how she wrote about the abuse. She actually talks a little bit about in the very end too, kind of her acknowledgments, I think. She handled it very delicately, because it's like this hard thing of, this is part of who I am. This is part of my culture. These are my people that I want to protect, that are good people, but they also do bad things. So I actually really appreciated seeing that conflict, because I think it's very real. Like, it's one thing where it's just like, that's my dad, he's an awful person, and you've kind of written them off. And when you haven't, and you spend your whole life learning to appreciate and become in tune with your ancestors and your people, that's a really, really difficult thing to navigate, the good and bad, you know. And part of it, we kind of talked about it before, is coming to peace where you are at now, like being present. So there's almost this part where it's like, you know what, I have to be grateful for everything I've gone through if I'm happy for who I am now. That's a peaceful way to look at it, you know, but I mean, we're not going to deny that bad behavior is bad behavior.
And they definitely had beautiful, wonderful moments together too, which just adds to that complexity and the conflict. She writes, "He learned anger as a method to control sensitivity." And she talks a lot about how there is a macho-ness, a bravado that men in her culture have to have, and that her father was really broken because he suffered the loss of his mother at a very, very young age. She writes, "My father would get angry. He would get angry because his mother died of tuberculosis when he was a baby, because his father beat him, because he was treated like an Indian man in lands that were stolen away along with everything else." So there is something so much bigger at play when you're a part of a community that has been so oppressed. There's definitely the added weight to that. And this line speaks to the complexity and the conflict that we were talking about. She writes, "I adored him and I was afraid of him. Together, both of those places lived within me." So definitely not a black and white situation. Now, where it is a black and white situation is with her stepfather. So her parents end up getting divorced, and her mother remarries. This guy basically woos her mother and is like the coolest dude until they get married. And he happens to be a white man. And then all of a sudden, it was like a flip switched, and he becomes abusive towards the children. He's extremely strict with them. Throughout the memoir, she talks about how he has kicked many of them out of the home, including her kind of at one point, which is why she ends up going to art school, which we'll talk about very soon. And he would beat them with belts. Joy starts to see the mother that she knew, who was a light, who would dance around the house singing, just completely diminish. And she writes, my mother confided that there was no way we could leave. He said he would kill her and her children if she divorced him. He'd leave our bodies in a burning house. He said it would look like an accident. No one would ever know. We both knew he would do it. And she's being told this by her mother as like a teenager. And that is so, Joy is a very intuitive person. She understands the situation at home. She talks many times about always trying to be this perfect person in order to avoid her stepfather's wrath. But what a burden to bear, to know, like, that is huge.
You know what's interesting to me is in her writing, I never felt like she definitely talks very lovingly about her mother, but she's never very defensive or protective of her mom. And I think that like that is horrific for a child to have to hear, experience all of that. And I feel like ultimately I kept wondering, and maybe it's a projection, but I kept wondering as I read it if it was one of those situations where you got yourself into this and you're putting us, like if there was a sense of blame because
Or betrayal.
yeah, from her mother,
Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
she never liked him but all the while understanding that her mom had to make these choices for what seems like survival. But I think that that's where she, instead of saying something harsh about her, she kind of just doesn't say a lot of like defensive things like my mom had to, or, you know, she was just surviving. She did the best she could. Like she doesn't say any of that stuff because it's one of those, I think she kind of holds her mom accountable for the choices that she made in life that put her through hell too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. She does talk about later when Joy comes home pregnant from art school. She writes, my mother was disappointed with my life and did anything she could to keep from coming to the side of town I was living in. She had grown up in worse and had cleaned and cooked her way to decency. My life was now a mockery of her struggle. So it almost feels like it's a two-way street in that regard, where at some point they just stopped. They just both felt betrayed by one another. Joy's mother, by the choices that Joy makes.
We go through life experiencing, well, in her circumstances, terrible things. We know we don't like it, but somehow we still want to please our parents. We would still want to make them proud. We still want to do better. Yet, ironically, we follow right in their footsteps. It's what's modeled to us, and we think that as we take it in, we're learning what not to do. But somehow, I feel like we all, I mean, some of us can break that pattern through practice, but at some point you do find yourself repeating the same things that your parents have done, even though you tell yourself while you're experiencing it, I'm not going to do that. This is terrible.
Well, and I think too, because like we've talked about, there's such an emphasis on respecting your elders, ancestry, like the sacrifices that your parents made for you, which is exactly what this quote says too. Like her mother felt like all of her struggles, everything was for nothing. When Joy came back pregnant in poverty, it was kind of like, why did I do what I did if this was kind of how you're going to repay me? And I know you've felt pressure from your parents being immigrants to like come here and realize the American dream in a way that makes them the proudest or the happiest.
100%. And, I think with any minority group in general, that feeling of being oppressed for them, they were stripped from their land and sent
Yeah.
off, many people dying. I mean, it was literally genocide. To be able to survive that alone is already like, holy shit. Even for her to talk about abuse and stuff, like my life is nothing in comparison to them. I must survive, even at that base level. But it's just such an unhealthy way to think. We are lucky to not have to live with those types of trauma. But we have our own trauma. And I think that that comes from our parents compare a lot. So we end up comparing. But we live in
Mm.
different generations and it's just really hard to compare. But yeah, there's always that pressure that we've been through so much. They almost trivialize our generation's trauma. Not saying that that's how Joy's mom saw it, but I definitely feel like in our family, it's like we've been through war. Your trauma is nothing. Pull up your bootstraps and get it together, kind of thing.
Well, to sort of jump ahead a little bit, which, we can jump around. This is like a book club style situation. Her second husband is extremely abusive. She does literally follow in her mother's footsteps in that regard, where she talks about exactly what you were just saying. She writes, there were no safe houses or domestic abuse shelters then, especially for Native women. We weren't supposed to be talking about the personal difficulties when our people were laying down their lives for the cause. We were going to put aside all of our domestic problems for the good of our tribal nations and devote our energies to our homes and justice. These fathers, boyfriends, and husbands were all men we loved and were worthy of love. As peoples, we have been broken. We were still in the bloody aftermath of a violent takeover on our lands. Within a few generations, we have gone from nearly 100% of the population of this continent to less than one half of 1%. We were all haunted. She does end up kicking him out, which is kind of like a really huge deal in the community. But to have that like heartbreaking conflict inside, like, do I have the right to stand up for myself and for my children and get rid of this abusive person out of my home, because then it could reflect poorly on us as a Native American people? That is huge. That is so huge for one person to have to bear the weight of that.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's like it reflects poorly on the men of the group, just her idea that the priority and the energy spent should be on supporting the community and lifting each other up, even if the men or the few in there are pushing some down. I think it is the luxury for us to say that that's heartbreaking and it's awful, because that is actually it's a reality for many. I mean, they are still fighting for their own rights, and I'm sure that that is very true. At the end of the day, what is the biggest cause for our people right now? Not to minimize the abuse, but it's one of those sad things where it's like picking your battles.
Well, I'm personally glad that Joy picked herself in that battle and that she wasn't going to let her community dictate her safety and her family's safety. And that does break my heart for women who are in that situation. Going back to her stepfather is this extremely crazy, insane, abusive force. And he basically tells her mother, Joy needs to get out of the house. Like, I don't want her to be a part of this household anymore. And he's trying to find some military school to send her to. She does not want to do that. And fortunately, she comes across the IAIA, the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. It's a boarding school. So she's able to go and stay there and live there and study art. She writes, it was in the fires of creativity at the Institute of American Indian Arts that my spirit found a place to heal. I thrived with others who carried family and personal stories similar to my own. I belonged. Mine was no longer a solitary journey. We were all skins, traveling together in an age of metamorphosis, facing the same traumas from colonization and dehumanization. We were direct evidence of the struggle of our ancestors. We heard them and they spoke through us. So thankful that she found this school and was able to escape that horrific situation. This is where she meets her first husband and she becomes pregnant and then ends up back in her hometown, living on the other side of the tracks in poverty. Eventually, Joy gets herself out of the situation. She talks about how a man from the circus tries to ask her to like run away with him, which was
So
did not see
random.
that coming. It
Seriously.
was so random, but she will not abandon her child. But she does write, I could hear my abandoned dreams making a racket in my soul. They urged me out the door or up in the night so they could speak to me. They wanted form, line, story, and melody, and did not understand why I had made this unnecessary detour. Think for yourself, girl. Your people did not walk all that way just so you could lay down your dreams. I wanted more and didn't know how I would get it. My days were consumed with the drudgery of survival. I took care of the household. I negotiated with my husband, who was essentially a boy. He didn't know how to grow up. His father had abandoned the family and he had no father map. There were flashes of joy, but this wasn't enough to sustain the need for artistic expression. I believe that if you do not answer the noise and urgency of your gifts, they will turn on you or drag you down with their immense sadness at being abandoned. As a creative person, I really understood that feeling. Obviously, my situation is nothing like Joy's. I have a very supportive husband, and we have the financial means for me to be able to pursue my creative pursuits. But when I go too long without writing or working on something like this or doing something that fulfills me creatively, I fall into a funk. It feels as though a small part of me is withering. And it's a really important part of me. It's a really big part of my heart and who I am and my essence. I thought that she just articulated that so beautifully.
I think too, it's actually nice to see that almost every time she meets adversity, it comes back to this. Whether it's the first time she was listening to that song with her dad, she remembers it, or seeing her mom dance. Like it always comes back to her dreams or something creative, music, dance, storytelling, art. It always came back to art with her, which I wish she did write more when she finally got to pursue that passion and was successful in it.
Yeah, that's where the memoir ends, is when she finally, I think, aligns herself with poetry. She has since written a second memoir, which just recently came out. So maybe that's more of her journey as a full fledged poet. But I did appreciate that this memoir was about getting to that point where everything came together and she was able to pursue what her heart desired, what her soul needed, what her ancestors were telling her was her path. And she does have things, I don't want to say go her way, but like her husband cheats on her. So that gives her the ability to leave him.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem like there is this divine intervention that's happening to help get her back on the path that her ancestors and the knowing know that she needs to be on. She ends up going to college, and this is where she meets her second husband, who she calls the poet. And she writes this about him: our dark sides are compatible, which, oh man, we've all kind of been there a little bit.
Mhm.
She also writes that his poetry opened one of the doors in my heart that had been closed since childhood. Together, we nurtured a common language. When you just like recognize someone else's soul as being a counterpart to your soul, obviously their love story does not have a happy ending. We've already talked about that. He becomes abusive. She does end up leaving him. But at that moment in time, he was right for her. Like you said earlier, where if you want to make peace with who you are and where you are and feel okay with all of that, you do have to recognize that that was a part of your journey and part of who you are and why you are who you are.
Yeah, I think at least the way she wrote it, every negative force that came her way pushed her in a direction in life that led her to where she is now, which is in like alignment with her creativity and her dream. I mean, her stepfather coming in, she probably, I don't know if she would have gone to that art boarding school. And then having the baby with that boy, it's like, would she have left home? She graduated and had nowhere to, like, she didn't know what she was going to do coming home. And then meeting this guy, it's just like, it opened up her poetic side.
Exactly. And that's just a perfect segue into the last big discussion point that I want to talk about: art as a savior, as a healer. Joy starts the memoir off talking about music. And then when she goes to the Indian art high school, she focuses on painting there. And she writes, when I painted, everything went away: the seductions, the need for attention, the missing fathers, the fearful mothers, the evil stepfathers. I could fly to the moon and to Venus too if I wanted. I was also from somewhere far away, the other side of the Milky Way, and would return there someday. I knew it, as I knew I could count on cerulean blue to be absolutely cerulean blue when I spread it on the canvas.
You know what we're all thinking though when you say cerulean blue.
Devil Wears
Of
Prada.
course.
Cerulean blue is my favorite shade of blue. She makes her way back to painting later when she goes back to school after her first marriage and she's an art major. She talks about feeling really close to her ancestors when she painted. She was really able to especially harness and access her grandmother, Naomi Foster. And she writes, I felt sadness as grief in her lungs. The grief came from the tears of thousands of our tribe when we were uprooted and forced to walk the long miles west to Indian territory. They were tears of the dead and tears of those who remained to bury the dead. We had to keep walking. We were still walking, trying to make it through to home. The tears spoiled in her lungs became tuberculosis. She exists in me now, just as I will and already do within my grandchildren. No one ever truly dies. The desires make a path. We create legacy with our thoughts and dreams. This legacy either will give those who follow us joy on their road or will give them sorrow. Just as I felt my grandmother living in me, I feel the legacy and personhood of my warrior grandfathers and grandmothers who refused to surrender to injustice against my peoples. She just, as you have said, has such a respect and love for those who came before her and wanting to do right by them while also wanting to walk her own path that she knows she has to walk. And it's just really touching reading all of these parts about her ancestors and her grandparents and everything that her peoples had to endure and the weight that she feels with that, how it continues to drive her and motivate her.
The way she wrote this book, I would say for me, the biggest underlining is like beauty and fragility. All the pain, all of the things that the community has suffered, the things that she has suffered, she has found beauty in it.
And to that point, she writes, "It was the spirit of poetry who reached out and found me as I stood there at the doorway between panic and love. There are many such doorways in our lives. Some are small and hidden in the ordinary. Others are gaping and obvious, like the car wreck we walk away from, meeting someone and falling in love, or an earthquake followed by a tsunami. When we walk through them to the other side, everything changes." And this is how she ends her memoir. She writes, "To imagine the spirit of poetry is much like imagining the shape and size of the knowing. It is a kind resurrection light. It is the tall ancestor spirit who has been with me since the beginning, or a bear, or a hummingbird. It is 100 horses running the land in a soft mist, or it is a woman undressing for her beloved in firelight. It is none of these things. It is more than everything. You're coming with me, poor thing. You don't know how to listen. You don't know how to speak. You don't know how to sing. I will teach you. I followed poetry." So everything and nothing, no big deal. But that is how it feels sometimes.
Well, it's the idea that sometimes we feel so like the world is caving in on us, and then you have that moment where you realize we are like a speck in this world. You know what I mean? It's just like perspective all the time. Have you heard of the Cherokee Rose?
No.
I was watching Walking Dead, and they actually brought the Trail of Tears up. So the Cherokee Rose is, I believe, like an Asian, like a native Asian flower, and started sprouting on the Trail of Tears. And the story behind it is the genocide and the loss of children and families. The women were crying, and with their tears came up this beautiful flower to represent perseverance, like something where nothing can bloom. This beautiful rose came about.
That's really
It's
lovely.
kind of crazy that I literally just watched that a couple days ago on Walking Dead.
It's all connected, baby. I'm telling you. It's crazy when you start really noticing and paying attention to the ways that life seems to be giving you signs about certain things. It gets
That's
wacky.
why it's like it's everything, but it's also nothing. Kind of thing, like,
Yeah, totally. It was a really beautiful read, and it made me want to seek out other Indigenous women's memoirs to get an even fuller perspective. So there are just a couple of thought-provoking quotes that I wanted to read, and then we'll be done. I loved this quote. She wrote, "As I sketched, I considered the notion of warrior. In the American mainstream imagination, warriors were always male and military, and when they were Indian warriors, they were usually Plains Indian males with headdresses. What of contemporary warriors? And what of the wives, mothers, and daughters whose small daily acts of sacrifice and bravery were usually unrecognized or unrewarded? These acts were just as crucial to the safety and well being of the people." I just love that she acknowledges that the women were really the foundation. The women are the foundation of all these damn cultures, let's be real, of all the people.
I know.
We are the foundation. And this is a great quote to end the episode with. She writes, "In the end, we must each tend to our own gulfs of sadness, though others can assist us with kindness, food, good words, and music."
It's a sense of community. I think it's the quickest way to happiness.
That's it for Crazy Brave by Joy Harjo. This memoir was a beautiful and moving portrait of Joy's endurance and strength in the face of systemic oppression and abuse. I appreciated learning a lot about her spirituality and her connection to her ancestors and how she channeled them through her art and how much importance she places on creativity and art, because I am also led by those things in my life. She includes a few of her poems in the book, and like all the memoirs that we discuss, there's more to her book. So I highly encourage everybody to pick it up. It's a very short read. It definitely takes a little bit of getting used to her writing style, but there's a lot to unpack here. And I think that it's a really important, like all of these women, these stories are really important. Before I say goodbye, you and I discussed this before we started recording. This is from katiecouric.com. In 2020 alone, there were 5,295 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls, according to the National Crime Information Center. And this crisis hasn't gotten better in recent years. In August of 2023, the Alaska Department of Public Safety reported 280 missing Indigenous people in a first of its kind report. Some places are worse than others. In Canada, the rise of missing and murdered Indigenous women, also known as MMIW, has been declared a genocide, and a report was issued in 2019. Among the key findings, it found that Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to be murdered or to go missing than members of any other demographic. While almost 60% of the reported MMIW cases are homicides, the vast majority remain unsolved. Another report found on RAIN.org says that 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls occurred in 2016. We were talking about how there's just a lack of coverage in the media around missing Indigenous women. These statistics are horrifying, and so is the lack of awareness being made about these women. Thank you, Priscilla, for bringing this up before we started recording the episode.
Of course.
I think it's really important that we know this.
I hope this prompts others to learn more and speak more about this underrepresented community.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for reading this book and talking about Joy's memoir with me today.
Thanks for having me. Do you want to say what you got most out of it and what you hope readers get most out of it?
Oh, that's really good. Yeah. I would say that I feel like the thing that I got most out of Joy's book was just her strength and her perseverance. Like I said, the importance of creativity, because creativity and art is something that moves me, that guides me on the path that I walk. And it was just really lovely for me to connect with another person who values that and sees the spiritual importance of that. What about you?
I think for the most part, what I really enjoyed is the relatability of like connecting to your roots, connecting to your heritage, taking in all of the horrific events in her life. I think if readers were to read her memoir, I hope that they can find comfort in someone else who has lived through tough, troubling times and has been resilient through it all, and also is inspired by the opportunity to connect with their roots.
And to connect all of us. As the Poet Laureate, she did that fantastic project to elevate Indigenous people's voices, which is very important.
And with this podcast being focused on females, hopefully it's a chance for all females to connect and feel empowered together too.
That's right. More empowerment, baby, more connection. We are here for it. I love you. Thank you so much.
Love you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our episode today. And I hope you all feel empowered this week. Thanks for listening to Babes in Bookland. To access the full version of this episode, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or support us on Patreon. Visit babesinbookland.com for more information.